Does Jerry Seinfeld deserve this? Ever since he visited Israel last year after the Hamas attack, he's been in the firing line for a certain strand of the pro-Palestinian movement that seems to mistake his humanist stance on the conflict as a condoning of war. This happened just a few weeks ago after Jerry attended the State of World Jewry address in New York, spurred on by his full-throttle public support for Israel. There's some nuances in all this that we need to explore, but first, watch this clip so you know exactly what happened. This is obviously not the first time that Jerry Seinfeld has taken heat for throwing his weight behind Israel in the conflict. Just a few years ago, he visited IDF training camps back in Israel and also traveled to meet the few hostages freed by Hamas back in December last year. But I want to take a second to make one thing clear here. It's hard to find anything that Jerry Seinfeld has said or done throughout his entire conflict that warrants calling him a supposed genocide apologist. Least of all drawing comparisons to 1940s Germany, considering his own beliefs in Judaism. He's not someone that has made inflammatory calls for continuation of the war, and is very difficult to accuse of being unfeeling toward the loss of innocent human life that's happening on both sides of this conflict. I think what we're seeing is a spilling out of unguided anger onto people that don't deserve the hate for standing on a baseline moral statement. In fact, that's exactly the sentiment he echoed when his wife posted this simple moral baseline in the trying times, quote, "I support my Jewish friends and the Jewish people," with the caption, quote, "If you don't know what to say, you can say this in your feed." And you know why that's on point? It's because a lot of us really don't know what to say. We don't know what side to be on and what kind of moral and political certainty to have. The only thing we can be certain about is that the loss of human life is the most tragic consequence of every such conflict, and that nations bereaved with a loss like this deserve people to stand by them in support.
When we look at the rise of anti-Semitism in this country and really around the world, what do you think of it?
She found a simple, and I thought, non-aggressive way to say something that, as we said, unfortunately needs to be said, but does need to be said. And I thought that was very special and fantastic thing she did. Hard to do.
It is hard
right?
to do. Well, simplicity.
Most things in that venue, it's going to trigger someone. It's going to inflame. We're so quick to inflame.
That's a sentiment that's very hard to dispute for anyone not on the extreme fringes of either side, and yet, instead of disarming people that want to read his support for basic humanity in the worst light, there seems to be a deliberate attempt to shut down anyone in the middle. And the result? More and more people just think it's not worth the risk to even speak out, leaving the ground open for extremists on both sides when the moderate humanists recede. I think Jerry Seinfeld understands that as well, because after he visited Israel back a few months ago to meet the freed hostages, he knew he had to keep a distance from reporters that could put it in a very difficult position. We saw a snippet of that back when Jerry came from visiting the families of the Israeli hostages, staying quiet and low when the reporters threw questions at him since he didn't know when it could flare up at any moment.
Jerry, how was meeting with the families? How was meeting with the families? What did you ask them?
סגור את האור, אשי. סגור את הדלת.
Do you see him wearing that tag around his neck? Engraved on it is a call for the release of all innocent civilians held as hostages, and given the charged current climate, it can very quickly turn into a point of contention. But can you really blame Jerry Seinfeld for laying low like this, both physically and with his opinions? It's fair to say that the Israel vs. Palestine conflict is the most divisive wedge issue in the world right now. That's because it's not just two nations at war, but two blocks of civilizations and arguably two religions in the conflict over what they believe is the Holy Land. That makes this conflict so different from any other geopolitical conflict because perhaps this is a potential flashpoint for much larger wars in the future. No one wants to be caught in the middle and made the punching bag for rage from both sides. That's a scary prospect for anyone, and even more so for someone in the public light as an entertainer, but it seems like Jerry Seinfeld has started to become a common target for protesters because he's faced his shows being disrupted before, like the pro-Palestinian protest outside his stand-up comedy special in Syracuse, New York in 2022. Doesn't that reveal something regrettable? What does Jerry Seinfeld even have to do with the entire conflict for him to deserve being made the punching bag for people's rage? The answer is practically nothing. He's not made any comment that could be deemed inflammatory or called for more war in a region already mired in it. In fact, Jerry is not even Israeli or has any roots in Israel, and yet, as a human, there is something that binds him to feel the plight of innocent people caught up in the conflict. There's a core that we can admire and replicate, especially at a time when being moderate and remembering the fundamental humanity of other people is made much harder than going too far on either end. That's the sentiment we saw expressed when Jerry visited the families of the hostages to hear their ordeal.
It makes us all proud.
We're just a simple person that put our heads up regarding all the circumstances and what happened in here, and we just want to come back home, and we will do whatever is necessary. And thank you for being here, for hearing our voice, and that you are our ambassador. So thank you so much for that.
I'm proud of that too.
It's truly interesting to see how easy it is for even the most moderate views to start to be drowned out in this conflict, and I think it's really ominous sign. The last thing we want in the world right now is for people with sensible and moral takes to remain quiet when their moderation is most needed. When you've got people scared, not willing to stand up to the fringe extremes on both sides, they're actually leaving the space open for those fringes to expand and fill. Unfortunately, that's exactly what we're seeing right now. If you actually step out into the real world away from the virtual lives we've built for ourselves, you realize that most people are really just normal and relatively more moderate than the impression we get online. We're living in a time when the loud extreme minority online is able to drown out the large silent majority, and that means everyone gets a very skewed image of what is really going on while feeding the distrust that has been sown from the start. On our part, I think the only antidote to that is to be able to stand for the humanity of both Israelis and Palestinians, and always watch our steps so we don't end up dehumanizing other people. We know the consequences of that in history, and we'd be making a terrible mistake at repeating that. Overall, I do believe that Jerry Seinfeld is one such sane voice, not because he's taking sides, because he clearly is, but because he's not so subsumed by the politics of it that he starts to pour gasoline on this raging fire. That's a respect for a basic humanity that a lot of people should replicate.